June 4th, 2022. Well, today I want to get into this ongoing debate about the gun control issue that's sort of raging ever since the Uvalde uh, uh, mass shooting at the school. Of course, this is always a dangerous time for rights and all, because people get emotional and a lot of them aren't thinking too logically. Um, but and as I point out in my previous video on Uvalde, these gun control proposals we're seeing will not be effective in stopping the problem. And of course, President Biden went full demagogue, I would say, the other day in his address to the nation on Thursday evening, um, basically touting all sorts of random things and being all over the place. He thought the 1994 gun control law, which was, I think, actually passed, I believe, in 93. That was in 94, that's right. Right before the election, that the Democrats lost the House for the first time in 40 years or something. Perhaps not such a good precedent. And in fact, this did little to reduce the capability of the guns that were being sold, except for perhaps the magazine limit. But everything else involved in it was basically cosmetic issues about the weapon or minor functional things. Might have some effect as a combat weapon, but probably would have absolutely no effect if somebody was attacking a school full of innocent children. And so it was, and he thinks that bringing that back would do some good. In fact, the statistical studies show that it had almost no effect on those issues at all. And we also have to remember that far more children are killed with handguns and one at a time in various street crimes, and basically due to stray rounds being fired by gangbangers than by any psycho attacking a school. These are rare events, and they need to be addressed more from a point of view of protection. And I'll get in more detail on that as we get into the video. By the way, if you like these videos, please subscribe. We need to get the subscriptions up. Give me a like if you do like the video and want to help the algorithm out, and you can click the bell for a notification. So that's kind of the way I look at this situation. And of course, the other day we were treated to some congressional hearings of a variety of new gun control laws that are being proposed in the House, which are probably going to fail in the Senate. Representative Mondier Jones went off on a rampage suggesting that we should eliminate the filibuster in order to pass these bills, and even rig the Supreme Court in order to hold up their constitutionality. And I'm like, this just shows us how absolutely radical the Democrat Party has become and how dangerous the Democrat Party has become. I mean, they're willing to totally overturn our traditional structure of government in order to pass bills at the moment. But remember, this is only one of the bills they wanted. Originally, they were going to do it in order to rig elections and to pass all sorts of tax laws and all sort of other things they want to do. And of course, these laws would be vulnerable to repeal as soon as if the other side were to win an election. And probably when the disastrous results of what they're doing were to be felt by the public, they may very well be found to be run out of office. Who knows? But at any rate, that's just, and then some other congressman was basically referring to the Second Amendment as bullshit or something. But this is the sort of thing you're dealing with. I saw an article in Salon today where they were basically trying to suggest that originalism was somehow nonsense. And I'm like, excuse me, but if the Constitution doesn't mean what it was originally meant to mean, then what does it mean? Whatever you want it to mean? If the Constitution is whatever you want it to mean, then it really means nothing. So you don't even need to have one. And if you have a fundamentally non-constitutional system, like they do in, say, Canada or UK, they can pass about anything they want, and that's why they're rapidly losing their rights there. But that's kind of the situation we're in with this whole situation right now, which has been one of the points I've been making. In fact, the origin of all these videos I've been doing that I started back before the 2020 election, where I was seeing the risk to our system with the more radical attitudes that the Democrat Party has been putting forward. Hopefully, we'll win the election in the fall and put these kind of ideas out of their reach, at least for the time being. In the long run, I think the country faces great peril over this sort of thing. But getting back to the Second Amendment, the Second Amendment obviously is about individual right to own firearms, quite clearly. And in fact, perhaps even other sorts of weapons. But basically, to look at the structure, to think about it logically, the left has tried to interpret as the thing about the phrase at the beginning about maintaining a well-regulated militia as somehow having to do with states' rights to maintain a militia or something. However, if that was what it was about, there'd be no need for them to say that the right to keep and bear arms would not be infringed, because, I mean, if the states were to have a militia, in fact, it doesn't say the states to have a militia, actually, if you look at it carefully. But is there any likelihood that there would be any reason to put a provision in the Constitution to protect a government's right to have arms? Seriously? There'd be no reason. The government would, of course, have the right to have arms. That's inherent. What the concern was and what the precedents were is that other governments in the world would take away the people's right to have arms. And therefore, that's why that constitutional provision was put in place. It's very simple. It shows just how absolutely ignorant or absurd or deceptive certain members of the media and the left judiciary, even including members of the Supreme Court, have written opinions along this line, which makes you wonder what their elite Ivy League educations really have taught them. Or, in fact, are they really being deceptive and not really following any logical reasoning whatsoever? I mean, it's one thing so at any rate, I'm just saying that that's the issue. The other issue, well-regulated, seems to suggest, in fact, quite the contrary to what Biden is saying contingently about denouncing people's right to have the weapons of war, specifically says that the people do have the right to have weapons of war, right? I mean, if it's going to be well-regulated, it means it has to be similar to what the military would use in order to be part of a militia, right? So therefore, it should have features such as the same ammunition types, the same basic capabilities, the same feed mechanisms as standard Army rifles would have. Okay, so logically, that would suggest that instead of something like an AR-15 being banned, it should in fact be precisely what is permitted. Now, one could argue, well, and of course it's not an assault rifle, because an assault rifle is a select fire weapon, having both full automatic and semi-automatic capability. And of course, the AR-15s are only semi-automatic only to be in conformance with the Federal National Firearms Act back in the 30s. And of course, a modification of the law that was made in 86, which that's an interesting point of contention, of course. But essentially, even as a semi-automatic version, it could be useful for national defense in an extreme emergency. One would obviously realize that such an emergency is very unlikely to occur in the modern era, I suspect. I mean, the idea that we'd actually be invaded by an actual army from a foreign country, not a wave of civilians coming in to get benefits or job opportunities, but an actual army. It seems unlikely that would be a problem. But that's, again, there was a basic mechanism by which the Constitution can be modified, and it's not modified, that simply. Another reason I think that it was put in there, if you study the history of this, was that the founding fathers believed that it was good for the have an armed public because it would be a limiting factor, a deterrent for the country becoming too authoritarian, ultimately. I've often made the analogy that people having weapons of this sort vis-a-vis the government is somewhat similar to countries having nuclear weapons as a deterrent against other nuclear weapons. Actually, using them would be an absolute disaster for the people involved, just as it might be for the country involved. But on the other hand, you could argue that it would also deter the country from becoming too authoritarian. And so that I think that was but at any rate, that's the concept they had at the time. And remember, these were revolutionaries who actually wrote this Constitution, who'd actually staged a successful revolution against what at the time was the world's greatest power. So they were quite serious about this. And like I said, if somebody wants to think it's obsolete, then they need to go through the constitutional amendment process to repeal it. Of course, we know that would probably fail because it would require 38 states legislature to pass it, and a two-thirds vote in both houses, all of which is not not likely to occur anytime soon. But at any rate, so therefore, that's why they're trying to do workarounds like just ignoring the Constitution or rigging the Supreme Court. But as it is going forward, my own suspicion is at the present time, although there's a lot of concern on various things, it looks like the Republicans are pretty well sticking to the idea that what we need to do about the current situation with the school attacks is to provide greater security around the schools, to harden the schools. I mean, after all, the Uvalde school had a fence that was probably no more than at most 4 feet tall, if that, with no barbed wire or anything on top of it. Easy for a person 18 years old, male, to clear. And so it's totally inadequate. Obviously, school security needs to be better than that. And also, given the fact that this case, it's a complete law enforcement screw up that really occurred, let's face it. I mean, we had a person out there who left the scene of shooting his grandmother with this rifle and then had opened fire on people, I guess, near a funeral home, and then turned around and was apparently shooting at the school with police officers apparently on the scene, and then it was allowed to enter the school. I mean, I'm still kind of understanding why he wasn't engaged outside of the school, but perhaps at any rate, let's face it, part of the problem there was that you're in a small town which isn't used to big time crime or gang warfare, and probably just wasn't really that up to date with a really state of the art SWAT team. And that's kind of what happened, actually. It's a tragic thing. And then the fact that the door was somehow left unlocked or didn't latch properly, allowing the assailant to enter. But again, there's no perfect security that's going to be achieved, but certainly increasing security around schools is probably the way forward. And I think that Senator Cornyn's fix the so-called NICS system of background checks is valid. And what they're talking about there is simply not changing the requirements upward, but simply getting a more comprehensive program of getting all the relevant data into the system. Because we've been cases where people passed the background check in 2 of these instances who should have been banned by the law and actually committed a federal crime when they signed their form for applying for the background check, but the system didn't catch it because it didn't have the data in the system, even though it was available elsewhere. And so that's certainly a good idea. But the question is, will the radical Democrats, particularly in the House or even the Senate for that matter, be willing to pass this, or are they going to insist on keeping it going on to maintain an issue and scream about nothing being done and blaming Republicans? And that remains to be seen. But that's the situation we're faced with now. My own thought at the moment is probably nothing that's going to severely restrict gun rights is likely to be passed at this time. Hopefully not. I think it'd still be wise for everybody to contact their senators and congressmen or ladies to make it perfectly clear that we don't want any greater restrictions on our gun rights, and that we fully support the Second Amendment. But these other issues are probably a good idea. The question is, can a compromise be reached? I mean, in a previous instance, in fact, the other thing that keeps being thrown out is this universal background check thing, which is designed basically to convince people that we really don't have background checks, but we actually do. We have a pretty consistent background check provided the system has the data in it. The problem is, as a practical matter, though, what they're talking about is the idea of trying to ban person-to-person sales. But essentially that would just be, that isn't a major factor at all in criminal acquisition of guns, except for those guns that are actually being sold deliberately by criminals to criminals. And I think that's where you see a lot of that issue coming up. And I think better enforcement of the existing laws would certainly do a lot to deal with the street crime issue, which is, again, the major risk to human life. The mass shootings get a lot of notoriety, just like an airplane crash does, over the routine automobile accidents that occur on every day. But it's the automobile accidents day to day that kill far more people by far. And the same thing is true here. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed appropriately. Um, but certainly in the street crime things, like in the major cities, you have a mixture of really soft prosecutors, in some cases really bad laws, like in New York, for instance, and the fact that juveniles are running around illegally with handguns, which are currently banned. They're talking about the idea of raising the age. I mean, anybody under 21 is not supposed to have a handgun, right, under federal law, and yet juveniles have them all the time in these city shoot-ups and stuff, and they're caught with them, and they're almost never prosecuted. I mean, before anybody talks about putting on a new law, we ought to be enforcing the ones we have against the criminal element. At any rate, that's kind of what I think about the subject. We'll have to be on our guard against what might come up. But at the moment, I think Biden has kind of made a fool of himself with his approach, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens next. So, by the way, you can link my addresses of my social media are also in the links below, and we'll wrap this up for now.